Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In this video, I'm going to show you how to deploy AWS Lambda function using SAM CLI and then create an API endpoint using AWS console. This is part 2 of the develop AWS Lambda function locally with SAM CLI, Docker, Python, and VSCode workshop. In the part 1, I demonstrated how to develop and test AWS Lambda function locally using SAM CLI, Docker, Python, and VS Code. If you have not watched part 1 of this workshop for developing and testing Lambda function locally, link is in the description. Please do watch. Since this is a developer workshop, I assume you already have VS Code, Python, SAM CLI, Docker, and AWS Toolkit extension installed. We need all these software tools to develop Lambda locally. I will use a sample event request JSON to pass the parameter required for Lambda function and REST API. Here is the architecture design. As you can see, we are creating the Lambda function using the SAM CLI, and then we'll use API gateway to invoke the Lambda function. In API gateway, I'm creating a REST API via AWS console. So that is the manual steps. In part 3, I will use SAM CLI to create the API endpoint as well. Let's get started. I'm going to create a Lambda function in AWS Cloud using SAM deploy. Then I will test the Lambda function using AWS console. I'll create an API endpoint using AWS console. I will test the REST API endpoint using Postman, and then I'll review the logs in the CloudWatch. I'm going to skip through some of the slides since this is part of the part 1 of the workshop where I demonstrated how to develop the Lambda function locally. We're going to look at how we can deploy the function using the SAM deploy guided command. I'm going to run the SAM deploy guided or SAM deploy -g command on the command prompt. In a nutshell, several questions will be asked. We are creating a stack, a CloudFormation stack using SAM. So it will ask for a stack name. I can select the default name or I can provide a new name. There are several questions around the region, the rollback, the configuration file. I'm going to select the default setting. Once I have selected all the settings, SAM will create a change set. I'll review the change set, and then I will proceed with the deployment of the change set. Once this change set has been deployed, I can log into the AWS console, review my function, test the function, and validate that function is successfully deployed in AWS Cloud. Let's see it in action. I'm in my VS Code. Let's look at the function template YAML file. This defines the SAM code. Here is my Python function that takes the state code as a parameter and return the state name. And then there is a sample event JSON. Let's build it. And build. Telling me that there is a new version of CLI update. I will update it later. I can proceed with deploying the function at this point. So let's deploy. I'm going to select the default name. I'm going to select the default region, US East 2. Confirm change before deploy, yes. I'm going to select default options here. SAM configuration file, SAM environment, SAM is creating a change set now. Asking for the confirmation, deploy this change set. I'm going to say yes. Let's wait for the change set to be created. Create in progress. Creating the roles, creating the function, showing create in progress. And it has been successfully deployed. Let's look at our AWS console just to confirm it. I'm in my AWS console. Let's look at CloudFormation. I can see that a new stack has been created, get state app. If I click on it and look at the resources, all the resources have been created using the SAM CloudFormation. I'm gonna go to my Lambda. Yeah, I see my state function here, got created 4 minutes back. Let's click on this function. It's a small function, so I should be able to see my code here. The code is here. Let's test it. I'm going to replace this JSON with my test event. Let's call it test. I'm using the default template, format JSON, save it. Let's invoke it. And I have the result. I'm getting the state name back. So my Lambda function works. So Lambda function is deployed. We have validated it in the AWS console. What's next? So now we'll go to API gateway, create a REST API. We'll integrate with Lambda function. I will use the proxy integration, deploy the API to a stage. We'll test the API using AWS console, and then we'll test the API endpoint using Postman. API gateway, it's another service that create, maintain, and secure API at any scale. Let's look at a quick architecture diagram. We're going to invoke the API via API gateway. Gateway is doing proxy integration with Lambda. Lambda is invoking the dictionary function and returning the response back. It's all serverless, so no EC2 instance to provision. Let's go to our API gateway. Click on REST API and click on build. We'll choose a protocol. We're gonna select REST API. It's a new API. I'm gonna name it as get state API. I'm gonna select the endpoint type as regional. I'm gonna set up my get method. It's an integration type of Lambda function in the region US East 2. My function name I'm gonna select. It's the same Lambda function that I validated earlier. Let's look at our integration. Looks all good. I have it as Lambda function, my region, my Lambda function name. I'm using default timeout. Let's look at this API is not secure. I have not added any auth or API key. I'll be doing it in different workshops. Let's continue. Proxy integration is clicked. Our API is ready. We can test it by passing the query string, and then watch for the result. One thing that we need to deploy it in a stage. I'm going to select a dev stage and deploy it. That is all. And then we will get our invoke URL. This URL can be used by the calling application. And we can take this URL, invoke it via Postman or browser. I'm going to use the Postman to invoke the API. Once API is all done, we can secure the API by adding the subscription key. We can add a usage plan. Let's see it in action. Let's get to our API gateway. I'm gonna search for API gateways right here. Loading. I'm gonna create a new API. Let's take the REST API. New API. I'm gonna give my API name get state API. Let's call it 2. Create API. Creating the API. I'm going to create a method. Let's call Lambda function. Get method. Use a Lambda function. I think our function is get state SAM. Default timeout is 29 seconds. Let's create our method. Successfully created get. That looks good. This is our ARN. Let's deploy this API. I'm gonna select a new stage. Let's call it dev. Deploy it. Got our invoke URL. Let's take this URL and I will test it using Postman. I'm in Postman. Let's take our API URL. I need to pass it code. Let's test it. I'm getting the response back. If I change the parameter, I should get a different response, and I'm getting it. So our API is working as intended. Let's make sure that you delete this stack so that you don't incur the charge. Here is the CloudFormation command that you can use to delete the entire stack, or you can use SAM delete. Since API was created via AWS console, it will not be deleted by SAM delete. SAM delete will only delete the stack it created, which was our Lambda function. You will need to delete the API manually from the AWS console. Here is a quick SAM command reference. Here are the list of services that we have used: Budget, Cost Explorer, SAM, Lambda, API Gateway, AWS S3, CloudFormation, and IAM. We did not use it explicitly, but it got used by SAM behind the under the hood. With this workshop, developing, deploying, and creating an endpoint for the Lambda function has been successfully completed. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. In the next video, I will demonstrate how to create entire stack using AWS SAM CLI. Not only Lambda function will be created and deployed, but API will also be created and deployed with the same stack. An event will be added for the Lambda function that will enable the get method for the API. We'll then validate the API endpoint using Postman. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.